It all began here, in Greece. The way we are today, the way we think and behave, the foundations of our politics, education, yes, even our beliefs, all the things we regard as the basis of our culture are rooted in this tiny spot in the heart of the Mediterranean. Yet it's an unlikely place for a seed to grow. Greece is rocky, arid, uninviting. It juts out into the sea, dry and infertile in summer, battered by fierce winds in winter. Nevertheless, the basis of modern Western culture was forged here out of a civilization that struggled into existence 2,000 years before the birth of Christ. By the time Alexander the Great had built up his empire to engulf all of Europe and the Middle East, Greek culture had come to influence the whole of the then known world. Without the ancient Greeks, where would we be today? They gave us philosophy, medicine, mathematics, sport, theater, architecture, and even democracy. That too came from here. The appreciation of beauty, an ideal created for us by sculptors like Phidias or Praxiteles, working 2,500 years ago. Legends that have become our own. Heroes and heroines, gods and goddesses, leaders in peace and war. Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides dramatized stories of such emotional intensity that they still excite audiences today. Lying between Europe and Africa in the Mediterranean basin, Greece is a bridge between Europe and Asia, colored by both. That might be the secret. Even the plane taking us to Greece is a result of that marriage from which a culture was conceived that has influenced everything since. Atomic energy, television, the computer. How is it that this barren spot has given us so much? Let's try to find the answer together with the help of modern technology that never could have evolved without Pythagoras, Euclid, and Archimedes and their theories of mathematics. We'll visit the temples, the stadiums, theaters, glorious palaces, and humble hovels as they are now, and as they were then, in the golden age of Greece. Greece comprises only a small part of the continent of Europe. More than 80% of it consists of uninhabitable mountains. It's a rocky land of violent contrasts, conditioned by the sun and the sea. Water is so important to its survival that streams and rivers were regarded as sacred ever since very early times. In antiquity, the hills were covered in forests filled with wild animals, bears, wolves, even lions. The first Greeks appeared here around 2000 BC at the beginning of the Bronze Age. They were part of an Indo-European race that migrated in waves over a long period from across the vast steppes that separated Europe and Asia, and they began to populate the continent of Europe. They were a hardy mountain people, undaunted by the arduous journey, fighters from different tribes. United by a common language, they were divided in a fight for the few bits of fertile land. At first, they formed small rural communities, but between 1500 and 1200 BC, there was a period of tremendous growth, with magnificent structures erected, many surrounded by massive walls of great stone blocks. This primitive period gave birth to the mythology that was to be inextricably entwined with early Greek history. Fact and fancy blurred in the telling of the great legends, like the voyage of Jason and the Argonauts, the feats of Hercules, and the rape of Helen by Paris that started the Trojan War. Homer described that war in his epic poem, the Iliad, long considered a great work of fiction, but archaeologists have proved that there was such a conflict and that it was fought to determine control of the sea. The wealthy city of Troy in Asia Minor was attacked by a group of allied Greek states like Sparta, Mycenae, and Thebes, who forgot their differences temporarily to defeat a common foe. Troy seemed impregnable until it accepted the gift of the wooden horse, which contained a small group of Spartan commandos who opened the gates of the city to its enemies and so sealed its fate. From the outset, Greece was far from being a unified land. It was a combination of city-states which often squabbled amongst themselves. Each had its own local deity, which gave it its individual identity. They were proud and fiercely loyal to their home state and devoted to their patron god or goddess. By the 5th century BC, the population of Greece had risen to roughly 4.5 million. And its most celebrated city was Athens, protected from the north by the mountains of Attica and from the south by the Aegean Sea. Patron deity, Athena, goddess of wisdom and war. Despite the constant efforts of its administrators, modern Athens sprawls chaotically from the center, clogged with traffic. Back in 1840, the population had been reduced to less than 100,000. Today, it's over 4 million and growing. This sudden expansion took its toll on the city. Not even churches were spared. This one had a 5-story building erected on top of it. Great cities all begin near water. A small river wound its way through the plain near a central hill, the Acropolis, where the first settlers chose to make their encampment because of its easily defended position. With increasing prosperity, the village became a city, and in 1200 BC, the Acropolis was surrounded by Cyclopean walls. Later, Athens expanded further until it was one of the richest cities in Greece, with a thriving ceramics industry we'll be hearing about later. In the 6th century BC, under the great lawmaker Solon, one of the famed 7 sages of ancient Greece, the residential center was walled in, but the city expanded well beyond it and was left unprotected. Consequently, Athens was virtually destroyed by the Persian army when they attacked it. In the 5th century, Pericles ordered a new wall around the city. He commissioned the greatest architects of the time to begin the enormous task of developing the Acropolis under the artistic direction of Phidias, the famous sculptor. In the 2nd century, under the Romans, Athens reached its maximum expansion. A new wall was built around it, and many new buildings were constructed, like the glorious theater of Herod Atticus. But the most sacred and impressive part of Athens remained the Acropolis. The word Acropolis in Greek means the highest part of the city. Every ancient Greek city had its Acropolis, a citadel easily defended from attack that acted as a refuge in times of trouble. Originally, there was a spring up here, the Clepsydra fountain. The inhabitants revered it as a god of nature. Perhaps this was the reason the site became the focal point of Athenian temple architecture. Let's see how the Acropolis appeared in its primitive form, when it was just a rocky mound. Around 1200 BC, in the Mycenaean era, when there were only 3,000 inhabitants, the citadel became an impregnable fortress. It wasn't until Pericles, in 450 BC, that it began to assume the aspect we know today, with the Parthenon and the other temples forming a sacred area dedicated to Athena. It must have been a splendid view for anyone who was lucky enough to have a terrace facing this way. The deities were of utmost importance in daily life, and everything functioned according to the many religious festivals throughout the year. Sacrifices were made by the head of the family on the altar at home for the curing of the sick or protection against an enemy. In the 5th century BC, at least 100 days of the year were holy days. In what is now our month of July, a great procession took place as a climax to the festival of the Panathenae, to honor the goddess Athena. It was the most important celebration of the year. Every strata of society took part. Nobles and commoners, peasants and politicians, women and children climbed to the Acropolis, where 2 young virgins, chosen to represent the city, made a presentation of a richly embroidered religious garment called a peplo. It's time we took a look at the Acropolis as it appeared in the 5th century BC. Thanks to modern technology, we too can join the joyful procession. The entrance to the courtyard of the Acropolis was through the Propylaea, a monumental marble gate designed by the architect Mnesicles. It cost 2,012 talents, which was more than the entire annual city budget. Now let's see how it looked in the 5th century BC. The side chambers housed an art collection, an exhibition of pictures by the best-known Greek artists of the time. The light was certainly ideal for viewing. The courtyard from inside the Propylaea must have looked extraordinary too. The central statue of Athena, protectress of the city, was 22 feet tall, and her spear, her helmet and shield were of gold. The Parthenon is partially hidden on the right by the sacred wall of Artemides' temple. High on the terrace of the Propylaea stood the temple dedicated to Athena Nike, a gem of architecture, built between 421 and 415 BC during a period of truce in the war between Athens and Sparta. Athena Nike was normally a winged goddess, but her statue in here was without wings so that she could never fly away from the city. The Parthenon has always been the pride and joy of the Athenians. The style is Doric, and it was the largest temple in all of classical Greece. 95 feet wide and 300 feet long, it had 17 columns down the sides and 8 across each end. It took 15 years to complete, and it was finished at last in 432 BC. It was built entirely of locally excavated Pantelic marble, which is very special, as it changes color according to the light, from a cool white to a warm gold. Even today, it isn't so much its size that impresses as the perfection of its proportions and the precision with which it was designed and constructed. The friezes and the panels, known as metopes, recount the stories of the gods and goddesses and heroes who founded the city. This is how it looked after it was rebuilt. The Greeks loved color, so everything was brightly painted. Statues were decorated in materials of contrasting tones and textures. It is ironic that the image of Greek culture that always springs to mind is one of pure white marble, when their civilization was such a colorful one. As you can see from this metope, presented as it must have looked in the 5th century BC, monochrome was not in vogue with artists of the time. Inside the Parthenon, where restoration continues, stood another statue of Athena, also by Phidias. 36 feet high, it was covered in gold and ivory with glistening jewels for eyes. The statue cost 700 talents, an enormous sum at that time, enough to have built and furnished a fleet of 300 triremes. The squandering of this money irritated the citizens of Athens, who gave vent to their feelings on the anniversary of the goddess by attacking Phidias. He was arrested and imprisoned for profiteering, but escaped and fled to Olympia, where he remained in exile until his death. In 426 AD, the statue was carried off to Constantinople, where it was destroyed by fire, leaving nothing tangible for posterity. In actual fact, the most sacred temple of the Acropolis wasn't the Parthenon, but the Erechtheion, which held the most precious of the city's sacred relics: the olive tree, gift of Athena, the tombs of Erechtheus and Cecrops, heroes of the city, and the most revered of all objects, a roughly hewn wooden statue, generally believed to have fallen straight down from the heavens. But the most celebrated part of the Erechtheion was the porch of the Caryatides. The priestesses standing posed in this portico are in fact the columns which hold up the roof, with Doric capitals on their heads. One of them is now in the British Museum in London, replaced here by a copy, but it's almost impossible to guess which is the fake. Wind and weather has long since stripped them of their makeup, but they too were once painted to look like living women. A visit to the Acropolis was a very special event. A chance to mingle with friends and acquaintances. And as with all religious festivals in ancient Greece, it included games and theatrical performances, with as leading characters gods and heroes of mythology. These mythical heroes were all part of an unwritten history handed down and embellished in the telling that became the Greek legends which have fired Western imagination over the centuries and inspired so much of our own literature and figurative art. The Greeks elaborated these tales in a form that was completely new. They invented theater. The drama, comedy, and tragedy was born. Here in the shadow of the Acropolis, in an area sacred to Dionysus, the god of wine and worldly pleasure, masked actors first postured before the public. It was here the words of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides recounted the tragic and dramatic lives of Prometheus, Electra, Oedipus, Medea, Hecuba, and Andromache, to name but a few. Like the stadium, the theater was the gathering place most characteristic of a classical Greek city, and the performances were enjoyed by a very wide, mixed audience. Poor people were given free entrance by the state. These are examples of ticket tokens. Their enthusiasm and concentration span were incredible when you think that during the Feast of Dionysus, 4 or 5 different plays were performed. This meant listening to 20,000 recited verses during 40 hours of non-stop performance. Spectators who could afford it brought their own food and drink, often sharing with the less fortunate. Let's see what the theatre of Dionysus was like in the 5th century BC. Rudimentary scenery was painted on wooden panels to indicate the setting. The earliest plays were narrated by one person, but Aeschylus introduced a second actor and the impersonation of characters began. Actors were always male, and no more than 3 or 4 appeared in a play, which meant that they had to portray many parts, including women. So they wore a variety of masks, up to 28 in any one play, changing only the characterization of their voices. Having to work without the aid of facial expression forced them to perfect the art of gesture, much as silent film actors had to do at the beginning of this century. When actors portrayed gods, they were flown by pulleys and other complicated machinery. Their flying entrances were greeted with riotous cheering. There were a vast number of Greek deities. They were expected to behave much like mortals, involved in passionate love affairs and complicated intrigues. And although immortal, they were subject to the moral laws of men and paid the consequences of their behavior. If that sounds like a soap opera, it was. These were the principal gods and goddesses of Greece, and monuments to them could be found all over the country. Zeus, father of all the gods, god of thunder and energy, guardian of world harmony, protector of the family and its guests. Poseidon, his brother, god of the sea with an unpredictable character. Athena, goddess of wisdom and reason, protectress of all the great mythological Greek heroes. Aphrodite, born out of the spray from the sea, goddess of love, of beauty, and the spring. Apollo, protector of the arts. But however important the gods and their festivals were, they were not everything to the ancient Greeks. The family was fundamental to life. In Athens, marriage was a contract between the groom and the bride's father. Women had no say in anything. A girl had to obey her father's will. There was no ideal age at which to wed, though 30 for a man and 16 for a girl were standard. Athenian law permitted a form of divorce. A husband could rid himself of a wife without explanations. His only duty was to return the dowry he received from the bride's family. The real reason for marriage was the propagation of children, preferably male. At least one son was required to continue the line. An Athenian child spent his or her infancy with the mother or a nurse, usually a slave. They spent most of their time outdoors, thanks to the climate. Their games were simple. Boys played soldiers, as they still do. Girls had dolls, cuddly toys, and pottery animals to play with. Hide and go seek was popular, and they had swings. They were brought up to be very conscious of their bodies and cleanliness. This is a bath found at the city of Pylo from about 1300 BC. Women of the upper classes adorned themselves with jewelry and gold ornaments on festive occasions. Gold was mined on the islands of Sifno and Tarso in the Aegean. Combs were made of ivory and bone, and they wore makeup and perfumes made from extracts of herbs like mint, sesame, fennel, and cumin. They tinted their lips red with color from the cochineal beetle. What was an ordinary day like in the lives of these people? They were up early, often at dawn. After a frugal breakfast of wholemeal bread dipped in wine, the head of the family went off to the agora. The Agora was the town's central square, and it was the heart of every Greek city. In Athens, all important social and commercial activities took place there. It was always crowded, as it was the equivalent of Wall Street or the city. Women came to replenish their water supplies at the public fountains because private houses had no plumbing. All the space was taken up by shops and stalls, offering a wide variety of goods to their customers from all over the Mediterranean. Books were sold in one corner, in another, cooking pots and household goods. Elsewhere you could buy fresh vegetables, fruit and wines, perfumes, pottery, wooden articles, as well as ointments, herbal remedies, and miraculous medicines. Men did the shopping in the market. Payment was made in local Athenian currency, like the silver tetradrachma, although the currencies of other cities were often accepted, probably at a favorable exchange rate, for the vendor. A glance across the fence that separates the archaeological sites from the rest of the town will give you a fairly good idea of what the Agora must have been like. The Monastiraki quarter of Athens is still thriving even today, the commercial core of life here for over 2,000 years. There is still a market here, a bit like an Oriental bazaar, filled with a vast assortment of things, as the playwright Ebolus observed in the 2nd century BC. Everything can be bought in Athens, all in one spot. Figs, grapes, turnips, pears, apples, fish from every sea, animal offal, black currants, water clocks, witnesses, pulses, bull's blood puddings, and honeycombs. Bull's blood pudding remains something of a mystery, but most of the other items are still there, plus a few newer ones. Fish was more popular than meat, and every time the price of sardines or anchovies went up, there was unrest amongst the poor. The diet of the ancient Athenians was a very simple one. They ate a lot of broad beans and lentils, and there were always plenty of onions, cheese, and garlic available at mealtimes. Of course, there was also fruit, pears, apples, figs, and grapes. Their most elaborate recipe that we know of is for Spartan black soup, considered haute cuisine in ancient times. 1 pound of chopped pork, 1 cup of pig's blood, a pint of vinegar, an onion, salt and spices to taste, bring to the boil and simmer for 1 hour. Wine was the Greeks' favorite drink. The day began with a breakfast of bread soaked in wine. Sometimes the wine was watered down and flavored with herbs, such as thyme, mint, or cinnamon. The street which lies behind the Agora is now named after the Apostle Paul. It was a residential area for the well-to-do in ancient times. The 19th century German architect and painter von Klenz left us this idealized view of it. In the time of Pericles, even the homes of the wealthy were sparsely decorated. An inscription tells us that Alcibiades, a politician well known for his love of luxury, possessed surprisingly little furniture. The quarter where ceramics were produced was in complete contrast. It was densely populated with houses piled up against the city wall around the Dipylon Gate, one of the most important entrances into Athens. Various factories produced a vast assortment of pottery, employing a large, specialized workforce. These amphorae, plates and vases, at first were decorated in black and then red-painted figures, and were shipped to the markets of the entire Mediterranean area. Economically, the industry was as important to Greece as automobile manufacture or electronics are to many countries today. The potters' kilns and smithies' forges were kept hot night and day, making it a lively quarter with a busy nightlife. Gambling was part of it. Cruel sports, banned in most countries today, like cockfighting, were popular, and the stakes were often high. Gaily dressed and undressed women were more in evidence here than elsewhere. Prostitutes and dancers, as it was an area where most of the state-run brothels were concentrated. They were encouraged by the legislator Solon as a protection for family life, offering diversion to the men of Athens when they'd consumed a little too much wine. Let's return to the Agora, the city's center of commerce. The most important buildings were situated here, like the Stoa of Attalus. Discovered in 1953 and completely rebuilt, the Stoa of Attalus was one of the most imposing structures of all. Originally built by King Attalus of Pergamon in the 2nd century BC, it is now the Agora Museum. It was a building with large colonnades and storage rooms, not unlike a modern shopping center on 2 floors. However, it served more than one purpose. Philosophers held lectures and discussion groups here. The Stoic school of thought owes its name to the fact that Zenon, its founder, held classes in the Stoa. Animated political discussions took place here, but not everyone was privileged to take part. Women were forbidden even to mention politics and could not vote in elections. Their democracy, like ours, didn't apply to all, but perhaps like us they were trying to improve it. After all, the abolition of slavery is a comparatively recent development in our modern society. Important issues of state were debated in the Taulos Prytaneia, which once stood here. It was erected in the 5th century BC and was a circular structure about 20 yards in diameter in which the Senate met in conference. It looked like this to the senators who sat here on duty 24 hours a day. They were paid by the state, which believed a governing body never sleeps. They worked in shifts. Beds were arranged around the walls to make their stay more congenial. The whole area was dominated by the Phaeacion, built in Pericles' time, and today one of the best preserved of all the ancient temples still standing in Greece. It probably owes its excellent state of preservation to the fact that it was transformed into a Christian church dedicated to St. George in the 5th century AD. The metopes depicted 2 scenes of epic heroism: Theseus slaying the Minotaur, and Hercules, the male idol of his time, exerting his masculinity. This part of the city near the Agora, which the commuter trains now pass through, was once a sacred place dedicated to the 12 principal deities. There was an altar here from which the distance of everything was measured, because this was considered to be the central point of the city. Once one of the most important districts of Athens, there isn't much left. Let's see how this looked in 500 BC. The altar was surrounded by a low wall with 2 entrances. In front were fountains where visitors to the shrine could wash. Nearby was the Stoa of Zeus Eleuterio, a very popular meeting place frequented by Socrates and Plato, often seen discussing philosophy together. It was a tiny oasis of peace and meditation, where people could commune with their gods. Now trains come roaring through. But nothing is permanent. The gods may yet have the last laugh. To end our journey to ancient Athens, let's see how it looked under Roman domination in the 2nd century AD, at the time of its maximum expansion, when the city had a population of 500,000. Over the following centuries, the Acropolis reflected the fate of the city as a whole, reduced to little more than a village by barbarian invaders. The Parthenon became a mosque when Athens came under Turkish rule in 1456, and a minaret was added rather incongruously. Strangely enough, this guise protected it and kept it more or less intact until the 26th of September 1687, when it was struck by Venetian cannon fire in an attack on the Turkish army, which was using the Acropolis as a stronghold. The Parthenon was partially demolished, and the scars of that fateful day have remained ever since, and can still be plainly seen today. Restorers have found reconstruction to be something of a jigsaw puzzle, attempting to collect and compile all the tiny fragments strewn around, many of which have long since been removed. Fallen parts of the main frieze and other pieces of statuary were bought from the Turks at the beginning of the 19th century by Lord Elgin, the British ambassador to Constantinople. These pieces can be seen in the British Museum in London. One of the finest, most evocative temples in all of Greece was dedicated to the sea god Poseidon. The temple at Cape Sunion, a small promontory southeast of Athens. Ships from all corners of the Mediterranean passed this spot on their way to Piraeus, the port of Athens. Its ruins can still be admired today, standing against the skyline high above the sea. Cape Sunion was important not only for its strategic position, from which all naval movement could be observed, but also for the silver mines in the vicinity. Amongst the graffiti on its walls is the name of Lord Byron, the great English poet who died in Greece in 1824, a romantic expatriate fighting for the country he had adopted. His epic poem, The Pilgrimage of Childe Harold, which describes his travels through Greece, was inspired by some of his favorite places, like this one. This is how it must have looked to the mariners of ancient Greece, who on seeing it thanked the sea god for their safe return home. The life of a sailor was very dangerous in those days. Ships were not too safe and the sea often very rough. More than drowning, they were afraid of not being buried on land. Slipping away into the deep could not guarantee you any kind of afterlife. For this reason, sailors held Poseidon in high esteem, making copious offerings to the god of the sea and building temples like this one to honor him. Cape Sunion was strategically important to the Athenian navy because its fleet of triremes lay nearby. Warehouses for merchandise arriving and dry docks for ships in need of repair were constructed on the beach. This is a Greek trireme from the 5th century BC. It got its name because there were 3 rows of oars on each side. Tri means 3 and reme means oars. They were powerful machines of war. The Athenian general, Themistocles, used them against the Persians at the Battle of Salamina, which took place on the 20th of September, 480 BC. The Persians had over 1,000 ships, but the Athenians won, with only 310 triremes, and destroyed the Persian fleet. Our next port of call is Corinth. the city devoted to the cult of Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty. It was one of the wealthiest, most powerful cities in the Mediterranean. Corinth was the largest port in the whole of ancient Greece, a transit point for all commerce between East and West. It grew to be an extremely opulent, decadent city, but there is little evidence of its glory left. Of the Corinthian Acropolis, all that remains are these ruins, dating from the Middle Ages. It was the site where the temple of Aphrodite stood 1,500 feet above the city, attracting thousands of pilgrims. Most of the ancient city lies buried beneath this village, which has thrived on the unexpected tourism derived from the archaeological excavations carried on here since 1896, led by the American School of Classical Studies. The one Corinthian monument to have survived the fires, earthquakes, and man-made disasters that have plagued this place over the centuries is the Temple of Apollo, which dates from the 6th century BC. The once powerful capital of the League of Achaeos actually dared to challenge the might of Rome. As a result, the troops of the Roman consul Lucius Mumio were ordered to destroy Corinth in 146 BC. The inhabitants were either killed or taken as slaves, the city's riches plundered, and her buildings reduced to rubble. A century later, Julius Caesar ordered the rebuilding of the city in an attempt to atone for the treatment it had received at the hands of his fellow countrymen. Herod Atticus followed his example, restoring the Pyrene spring in the 2nd century AD. This fountain was renowned in legends throughout the ancient Greek world. It has a bittersweet story. Pyrene was the nymph who was married to Poseidon, god of the sea. She was the mother of Kencria, who was accidentally killed by Archimedes. It was Pyrene's unending tears that formed the source of the spring. Whatever the truth of it, the poor nymph's misery has brought great joy to the thirsty. Although Corinth was a maritime city possessing 2 harbors, its fame rested less on its commercial wealth than on its reputation as the home of the priestesses of Aphrodite, the sacred whores of the temple. This phenomenon of sacramental prostitution has baffled and fascinated Greek scholars. Most pagan religions are in some way involved in procreation or fertility, but the joy of sex, that seems to have been encouraged for its own sake. Only later was it condemned when Christianity arrived. More than 1,000 women pursued this way of life, but little is known about them, where they came from, or what became of them. All that's certain is that Corinth became famous all over the Mediterranean as a center for prostitution. Rich people would come to Corinth in search of the most beautiful women, and artists seeking models. Many a wealthy merchant was ruined by the seductive charms of these Corinthian Loreleis. The price of these ladies' favors varied greatly. Laide, one of the most famous courtesans, asked the celebrated orator Demosthenes for 10,000 drachmas as payment for one night. The average worker's wage was only 30 a month. The ethereals, as they were known, were not ordinary prostitutes, however. Some of them became extremely influential in society, like Aspasia, favorite of the Athenian statesman Pericles. She often accompanied him to important state functions and was his most trusted advisor. It may be hard for us to understand, but these women filled the void in Greek society left by ordinary married women who were relegated to raising children and looking after the home. They took no part in public life, leaving this role to the courtesans. The ethereals came from various backgrounds. Many had been slaves brought from far-off lands. The slave trade was actually second only to prostitution as a source of high income. The price of a slave could be as low as 50 drachmas for a child, or as much as 3,000 for a healthy adult like Plato, who was sold for that sum in Aegina. A corner of the agora was used as a slave market near the gate where perfume and oils were sold, as well as the most beautiful prostitutes in the Mediterranean. The strange mixture of sex and religion continued with the Romans. The Apostle Paul knew the city well, making his first visit when he traveled through Greece in the 1st century AD. He preached to the inhabitants and lectured them on their licentious behavior. While in a Roman jail, he sent a letter to the newly established church in Corinth, reprimanding the Corinthians for sliding back into their sins of immorality and idol worship, which had persisted into the Christian era. It's time to move on to another part of ancient Greece, Olympia, the city dedicated to Zeus, where the original Olympic Games took place. Most of the ruins of ancient Greece bake in the sun like bleached bones, but the monuments of Olympia nestle deep in woodland greenery. And it is in this setting of incomparable beauty that the games were played in honor of Zeus every 4 years, starting in 776 BC. The last time they took place here was in 393 AD, after they had been banned by the emperor of Byzantium, Theodosio, together with all pagan rites. During these ancient Olympics, arms were laid down, all wars ceased, and Olympia filled with athletes, ambassadors, and leaders from all over the Hellenic world. The Greeks, who were divided into numerous ethnic groups scattered over Asia Minor and Italy, were united by their enthusiasm for sport at Olympia and found they shared a common culture. Before they began, each competitor had to swear that he was of pure Hellenic blood, had trained for no less than 10 months, and agreed to stick to the rules laid down for the competition. The games were not played purely for sport. They were also performed to honor the most important of the gods, Zeus and Hera. Olympia was above all a sanctuary filled with temples and altars where visitors could pray and contestants consecrate their victories. The first monument, this one, the Temple of Hera, wife of Zeus, was probably constructed around the middle of the 7th century before Christ. In the 3rd century, it was used as a gallery where paintings and statues donated by the faithful were exhibited. It was in this temple that the celebrated statue of Hermes holding Dionysus as a child was found. Believed to be the work of Praxiteles, probably the greatest sculptor of all, in 330 BC, it is among the few masterpieces of Greek sculpture that was not removed to a museum or private collection of some foreign country. Let's see what the temple must have looked like to the athletes arriving for the ancient Olympic Games. On the summit of the temple was an ornamental disc that represented the sun. The solemn ritual of the Olympic flame was performed in front of this temple, a rite that still takes place today in the modern Olympic Games after an interruption of more than 1,500 years. They were revived in Athens in 1896 by Baron de Coubertin. It's hard to imagine that these ruins were once the greatest monument in Olympia, the Temple of Zeus. But it's been a victim of a series of natural calamities over the years. After the Parthenon, it was the second most important Greek temple in the world. It suffered earthquakes, fires, landslides, and was even buried in almost 10 feet of mud when the river Alpheus broke its banks and flooded the area. The earthquake of the 6th century AD left these huge cylinders of stone lying scattered on the ground as if they'd been hurled there by some giant hand. These blocks of marine rock, formed from fossilized shell fragments, were once the solid columns of the great temple that dominated all others in the sanctuary. This is how the Temple of Zeus must have looked on its completion in 456 BC by the architect Libon of Elide after 14 years of construction. Over 60 feet in height, 90 wide, and 180 in length, its measurements were indeed monumental, inspiring awe and admiration in all who saw it. All that's left is the outer wall. Of what lay inside, there is virtually no trace. Let's see what it looked like in the 5th century BC, when the double rows of stone columns were plastered and painted to resemble marble. The faithful from all parts of the Hellenic world gathered here to see the treasure it contained. Behind this balustrade, which stopped the public from getting too close. At the far end of the cellar, on a black Eleusinian stone base, sat the gigantic statue of Zeus by Phidias, which was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, made of gold, ivory, and other precious materials mounted on a wooden structure. It was over 25 feet high and looked far too big for the place it was in, according to the historian Strabon, who wrote, "If Zeus were to rise from his throne, he'd go straight through the roof." Why Phidias did not choose to make a smaller, more harmonious statue remains a mystery to students of Greek art. What is not a mystery, however, is the exact location of the studio where Phidias created the enormous figure. Here, only a few hundred yards from the Temple of Zeus, archaeologists have uncovered the place where Phidias created his great works of sculpture. Most of the ruins left here for us to see are what remain of a Christian church built several centuries after the death of the famous sculptor. The finding of a few implements and a cup with Phidias's name engraved on it securely placed his studio here beneath these ruined walls. Phidias built his studio with exactly the same dimensions as the temple, so that he could study the effect his masterpiece would have in a similar space as he worked on it. Once finished, the enormous statue was taken to pieces and carried to the Temple of Zeus for reassembly. No one knows what happened to the Colossus. Perhaps it was destroyed in the fire which damaged the building in 426 AD. Or it might have been taken to Constantinople like his Athena and destroyed there when fire reduced the city to ashes in 476 AD. But Zeus was not the only masterpiece here. The pediments of this temple are preserved in the museum at Olympia. On the eastern pediment there is a scene of a battle between the centaurs, violent creatures, half horse, half man, and the Lapiti, a people who lived in Thessalia, descended from the god Apollo, who is watching over them. The remains of 12 bas reliefs which adorned the temple have also survived, like this one depicting the capture of the birds of Stynphalia, one of the 12 labors of Hercules. Reputedly the son of Zeus, Hercules became one of the most audacious heroes of ancient Greece. He suffered everything, but stood firm and resolute. His legendary adventures, known as his labors, began when, as a baby, he strangled 2 monstrous snakes that threatened his young life. When the oracle at Delphi told him that to become a god, he must successfully undergo 12 tests, Hercules hurled himself into the effort with enthusiasm. He killed the lion of Nemea, won the belt of the queen of the Amazons, Hippolyta, captured the bull of Crete, the terrible boar of Erymanto, and exterminated the birds of Stynphalia, until all 12 labors had been performed. But he couldn't stop. Hercules continued to build up the legend of his prowess, creating the hero as we know him today, constantly finding new problems to tackle until his strength ran out. And he proved to be human after all. We return now to Olympia and the Olympic Games. The main athletic events took place in the stadium, which was reached through this long corridor that was once covered. Watching from the bleachers were crowds of up to 40,000 enthusiastic spectators. The track was over 190 yards long, a distance that legend has it was fixed by Hercules himself, who measured it out with his own feet. Winners received humble crowns of olive leaves, which they wore with great pride. There were 10 races, 7 for adults and 3 for adolescents. The most popular were the 200 yards and 400-yard races. The pentathlon was also very popular in 4 heats: running, wrestling, long jump, discus throwing, and javelin. Then there was the pancrazio, a mixture of wrestling and boxing, judged the hardest of all the Olympic Games. Training took place in the palestra, built specially for the purpose. In this ample space, there was plenty of room for practicing all sorts of sport, including wrestling. In bad weather, the athletes had a sheltered place that served a variety of purposes. As well as working out under cover, they oiled their bodies there and rubbed them down with sand and ash. Naked, gleaming with oil and whitened with ash, these men with their perfect figures had to appear not so much as human beings, but as gods, incarnations of ancient heroes. Poets like Pindarus in the 5th century BC sang in praise of the beauty of movement, like that of the boxer Satyros of Elide. As many centuries before, Homer had sung in praise of the heroes of the Trojan Wars. And their leader, Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, one of the oldest cities of Greece. This rocky hill hides what was once Agamemnon's city. An imposing cyclopean wall of massive boulders protected Mycenae, described by Homer as a well-planned city. Its streets were wide and spacious, linking the centers of the town where water was stored in wells. Today, as then, 2 lions guard the main entrance gate. They represented the strength of the Mycenaeans. The German archaeologist Schliemann, who found Troy, made one of the most sensational discoveries in the history of archaeology, within the city walls, near the Lion Gate. Basing his research on the diaries of Pausanias, a writer who lived in the 2nd century AD, Schliemann found a huge circular wall that contained the tombs of several kings of Mycenae. Inside them was an amazing treasure: jewelry, splendid vases, weapons and masks, in all some 30 pounds of gold. The archaeologist and his wife were so thrilled they mistakenly pronounced one of the gold masks to be the funeral finery of Agamemnon himself, the tragic leader of the Greek expedition against Troy. Agamemnon was actually killed on his return from Troy by his wife, Clytemnestra, who had become, in his absence, the mistress of Aegisto. Later, she was murdered by her son Orestes in revenge for his father's death. Orestes was then condemned to a life of torture by the Erinyes, monsters with female bodies and snakes for hair. The houses, warehouses, and grain silos treasures that belonged to the royal household and other wealthy Mycenaean families could all be found in the lower part of the city inside the fortified walls. The palace capped the top of a rocky hill and was adapted to the terrain on several floors. Various staircases gave the inhabitants of the royal palace access to the wide open courtyard in front of the Megaron. This was the center of the palace. The Megaron was a great hall with a huge fireplace in the middle. Visiting dignitaries were entertained here and banquets held, as well as trials. The walls were decorated with frescoes and the roof supported by painted wooden columns. It's hard to imagine that kings and queens once strode these palace halls and shared the same views as we commoners can take home with us today. Archaeologists have identified some important burial sites outside the walls. The most impressive for its size and state of preservation is certainly the tomb of the treasurer of Atrium. Built around 1300 BC, it consisted of a long corridor that led up to a wide entrance. The only beam was a single block weighing almost 120 tons. There was a large circular chamber, 40 feet high and almost 50 in diameter. In ancient times, its dome was second only in size to the Pantheon in Rome. An island in the Aegean called Santorini may hold the key to the most fantastic mystery of antiquity, the legend of Atlantis, the mythical city believed to have vanished beneath the sea after a terrible natural disaster. It is generally supposed to have existed in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. At least Plato thought so. But we're more likely to find it here, near Santorini, the island that was once known as Calliste. Looking at it today, with its pretty little whitewashed houses, the Orthodox churches facing the blue sea, the windmills. One might think this was just a picturesque, dull little island where nothing ever happens. You'd be wrong. The people of Santorini know that a monster lurks beneath the waves of that placid sea. The geological formation of the island is evidence of a violent upheaval that took place sometime in the last few thousand years. One glance at the shape of Santorini and you know you're looking at a volcano. 3,500 years ago, Santorini looked very different. There was no bay. In its place, a steep mountain rose 1,500 feet above sea level. It was a dormant volcano. Earth tremors and gaseous emissions warned the terrified islanders to pack their belongings and escape as fast as they could. The volcanic activity increased in fury until at last there was a terrible eruption. Most of the island was swallowed up by an enormous tidal wave, and coastal ports along the shores of mainland Greece were badly hit. None of the civilizations around the Western Mediterranean ever quite recovered from this catastrophe. In 1962, a Greek archaeologist, Professor Marinatos, came to the conclusion that there was valuable information to be gleaned from the lava and volcanic debris lying on the surface of Santorini. Clues led him to start his research at Akrotiri, a town on the southern tip of the island, and it was not long before he'd made some astounding discoveries. The Minoan Mycenaean civilization had a site of its own as rich as Pompeii. Professor Marinatos found it to have been a very advanced, sophisticated and wealthy civilization. The people of Akrotiri lived in large houses, several stories high. They were well organized. They had a complicated irrigation system, shops, warehouses, mills and looms. Life was carried on peacefully and efficiently. They cultivated barley and pulses, abundant wine and oil, and the women gathered saffron. Inside these houses, Professor Marinatos found fascinating frescoes, painted with a style and delicacy that would not be seen again until the Italian Renaissance. Frescoes like these antelopes on the walls of one room, or an amusingly vital piece of action, like this predatory cat teasing a duck. Only a tenth of the town has been excavated so far, so there is still a lot to find out about it. Jars still in their original positions contained vegetables, flour and cereals. The stairs that led up to the second floor of this house bear signs of the havoc caused by the eruption. An interesting group of houses facing onto a triangular space includes the so-called West House, which is full of wonderful frescoes. The houses here contained storerooms on the ground floor with guest rooms and reception rooms on the first floor. The second floor was for family bedrooms. Balconies and terraces added a touch of elegance to some of them. Despite the discoveries made on Santorini, many questions still remain unanswered about the early residents of the island. Where did they go after the disaster? At one time, the Greeks would have known of whom to ask such a question. They would have made a trip to Delphi to consult the oracle. The mysterious priestess, Pythia, would have had a ready answer. She lived in a cave in the foothills of Mount Parnassus. Some 2,000 feet above sea level, Delphi was the site of a very ancient cult, probably associated with Gaia, the Earth Mother. From 700 to 300 BC, thousands of pilgrims came to Delphi to consult the oracle. Kings, wise men, sailors, men and women rich and poor. It was here that the high priestess would go into her trance, wrapped in a swirling mist, her eyes staring from her head, trembling, as she uttered the disconnected phrases that were interpreted by the priests of Apollo in answer to the problems of the faithful. Whether these answers were of any use was cause for debate even in ancient times, as they were often ambiguous. The answer given to Croesus, king of Lydia, became well known. If you cross a river, you will destroy a great nation. He crossed the river, but to his dismay, he was defeated by the Persian Emperor Cyrus, and his kingdom brought to ruin and his subjects enslaved. The oracle was right. A kingdom had been destroyed, but it was his own, not his enemies. It seems a paradox that Apollo, god of knowledge and art, should be associated with such a dubious practice. But the Greeks have never been particularly concerned about logic. Delphi, like Olympia, wasn't really a city in the true sense. It was a sanctuary dedicated to the cult of Apollo. Hundreds of statues lined the sacred way. All that remains of them now, unfortunately, are the bases with the imprints of feet on them. These statues were donations from various cities as far-flung as Sicily and Asia Minor. The entrance to the sanctuary was like an open-air art gallery. It contained works like the bronze bull donated by the citizens of Corfu in 480 BC, who had it made with their profits from tuna fishing. an enterprise they discovered thanks to a bull who jumped into the sea and had to be rescued. Or the splendid bronze copy of the Trojan horse the people of Argos paid for, with the spoils of a victorious battle against Sparta. The pilgrims would walk past various treasures, small votive temples built to collect the offerings of other cities. Like this, a treasure offered in thanks to Apollo by the Athenians after their victory over the Persians at Marathon. Built of Paro marble, it was restored by the French architect Replat in 1906, almost entirely using material from the original ruin. Rebuilt, it looked perfect, but missing were the wonderful treasures that once lay within, which we can now show you. Weapons and shields torn from enemy soldiers in battle, gold and bronze objects, statues, even the prow of a ship. Along the road, before reaching the Temple of Apollo, the pilgrims could admire another 100 or so donations like the tripod of Platea, which was mounted on this base. The 40-foot-high legs were made of bronze, the cup of gold, spoils from the Battle of Platea in 479 BC between the Greeks and the Persians. Unfortunately, the statue of the goddess Aphrodite by Praxiteles, and posed for by the beautiful Phryne, was lost. Phryne was a very famous courtesan in her time. She was so proud of her body that she was happy to offer herself as a nude model to artists and sculptors. Accused of sacrilege for exposing herself, she arranged to have her clothes torn off at her trial, proving, as she had hoped, that a body as beautiful as hers could never cause offense to men or gods. She was acquitted. Apollo's temple was the focal point of the sanctuary. It has been restored a number of times since the original temple was destroyed in an earthquake in 373 BC. The original stone blocks and other fragments scattered around have been painstakingly assembled to make the temple as faithful to the original as possible. This is what it must once have looked like, when Delphi was at the height of its splendor. The theater in Delphi was of great importance. A musical competition was held during the games. Athletes had to be singers as well. Training in breath control served them in art as well as sport. All to honor Apollo, patron deity of the arts. Delphi was of fundamental importance in the colonization of Western Greece. All the pioneers of the 8th and 7th centuries BC came here to ask advice of the Delphic oracle before setting off to establish colonies on the southern coast of France, Spain, and most of all in southern Italy, which became Magna Graecia. But that's another story. Athens, with its magnificent Acropolis. Corinth, city of sexual freedom. Olympia, birthplace of the Olympic Games and one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Mycenae, city of Agamemnon, mighty hero of the Trojan War. Santorini and the legend of Atlantis, the lost continent. Delphi, the sanctuary of peace where thousands came to ask the oracle's advice. Places that have fired the imagination of people for centuries. A glance backwards into the past, and we can see in ancient Greece an important part of our own vast cultural heritage. It becomes a voyage of discovery that can open up a whole new way of perceiving ourselves, our civilization, and the world we live in today.